Hi everybody, I'm Dave Decosmo, and today I'm visiting the Nathan Denison House here in 40 Fort. This is one of the historic treasures of Luzerne County, and fortunately joining me today is Mark Riccetti Jr., who's from the Luzerne County Historical Society. Mark, good to see you.
Good to see you, Dave. Thanks for coming.
Listen, I'm glad. I wanted to see this and really learn about it for such a long time. Well, how old is it? How did it come to be here?
Well, this is the Nathan Denison House, as you said. This was his second Pennsylvania home. This one was erected in 1790. Now, we'll stop here for a minute just to take a look, because if you look at it, this is sort of an architectural oddity for this area. This is not what you would consider a northeastern Pennsylvania house.
No.
This is a colonial New England house.
Yes.
And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that being, of course, that Colonel Denison was from Connecticut, originally from Mystic, Connecticut. In fact, if you go to Mystic, Connecticut today, there's an exact copy of this house. Well, rather, this house is a copy of that, which is the original Denison House. Still stands today from the early 1700s. So when they moved here, when he finally built the new house after the war, after America had achieved its independence, he just sort of copied what he knew. And that's what we have today.
So much history here, and so much history inside.
Yes.
So I wonder, can we go in and have a look around?
Why don't we start? Let's go in.
Great. Would this actually be the main entrance to the place?
No, this wouldn't. We normally would come in the front door, which we saw outside, but I normally start the tour in here for a few reasons. One, to demonstrate the house is actually built sort of in a horseshoe. Mm-hmm. And it, if you're looking at it from our vantage point, if you were up above, it's basically a U. You have this room, and then you have two rooms on the sides, and then you have the staircase to go upstairs. And when you're upstairs, it's the same way. You have a little landing to get off, and then you have two rooms, and then the boys' bedroom is right above us. And the whole house, the U, centers on the chimney. Now, this is the main fireplace. We have 5 in the house. Every room but one has a fireplace in this house, and this is the biggest one, and as you can see, we still use this one. So we have a fire going in here. So I usually bring people in here to start. You have the table all laid out. You have candles. Sometimes we have fire going, sometimes we don't. And this is just a great opening entrance.
So all the food would be prepared here?
Yes, food would be prepared here. You would do your canning in here. You would heat your water in here. You wouldn't eat in here. This wouldn't be an eat-in kitchen. You'd eat in the family room, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you would do your cooking in here. You would do your baking in here. You would do all your prep work, roll your dough, slice your cheese, get your eggs ready, and then once the fire was ready to go, you would begin preparation.
It's a huge fireplace, but I can't help but notice maybe you can explain, on the side of the fireplace, you've got this separate door, but it looks like it's part of the fireplace.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dave. That is your oven. More specifically, that is what they called a 17-hand oven. Now, you could see in there, we have some wood back there, and it basically functions the same way that a brick oven does nowadays for a pizza. You'd build your fire back there, you'd let it burn for quite a while, and then you would take your fire out. And then when you take your fire out, do you know why they called it a 17-hand oven?
No, why?
Well, once you took your fire out, you of course had to test it, see how warm it was, and we have no thermometers or anything back then, so the women would actually have to stick their arm all the way in, and if they could hold it for a count of 17 without having to pull it out, it was about 350 degrees.
Wow.
And 350 degrees, of course, was perfect for your bread and for some of your pies and different bakings you would do.
Wow.
So it was a little bit of a more crude time back then.
But very, very efficient. I gather it worked very well. They had to bake and cook, and normally what type of things would you be cooking in that fireplace?
Well, we were very lucky in this area because you had quite a choice of food. There was still venison, there was rabbit, fish from the Susquehanna. The Susquehanna wasn't the way it is today. You could still utilize it as a food source. This soil in this area is incredible. That's why the settlers originally came down from Connecticut, was to farm. You can grow pretty much anything in here. I have a friend today who grows tobacco just to prove he can in Pennsylvania. He doesn't actually smoke, he just does it on a lark. So you would have corn, you of course would have wheat, you'd have bread, you would raise your own chickens and have eggs, cows for milk, and then of course you would use the milk and everything and churn it for butter. You know, this is a small butter churn. Everyone's familiar with the more larger ones that you sit at, but you could have even a small one like this, a table-sized one. So you weren't lost for foodstuffs in this area.
Most of the utensils made out of either wood, or else you have, I guess, some metal utensils as well.
Wood, metal, more of the stuff that you use every day would be tin or pewter, you know, just very durable, simple to clean, and you could get multiple uses out of something. You also would have clay and ceramic, which again, durable and just very easy to clean. Families would have fine china, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but you would very rarely use that. If you use that 10 days out of the year, it would be lucky. 9 times out of 10, it was very utilitarian items.
And just as with today's kitchens, you have to have shelves with some of your utensils. Rather, I think probably utensils more than decorations.
Yes. You needed storage space, you know, wherever you went. So you have your containers, you have your cups, hanging herbs to dry out, because of course you have to season your food, you have to preserve your food. There's no refrigerators, no ice boxes. So in order to make the food not only just taste better, but also to make it last longer, you have several herbs hung not just here, but also over the fire as well. And it dries them out and it seasons them and it gets them ready for using. So the kitchens back then were much more utilitarian than they are now. They weren't really style-based at all. This was a room for work. This was a room to prepare food.
And of course a candle appears. Well, would that be typical of the size used at the time?
Well, that would be about the size candle holder. They would normally be a lot longer. This one's been used a little bit, but as you see around the room as we go through, you have different sizes, but normally they'd be about yay high, give or take, when they started, and then they would burn down.
And you got another shelf over here, I notice.
Yes, more of the same as we come here. We have 2 more candles, different sizes. Of course, these are smaller as well. Here's actually your candle maker. So we have a few that are in there with the sticks and the wicks. Once they would harden, you would then pull them out, hang them to dry, and then they're 2 by 2, so then you would cut the wicks. So that gives you a rough idea. They're not quite that tall by the time you take them out, but gives you a rough idea of about how big the candles would be.
And talk about having to do everything yourself. We take it for granted we put a candle in a holder and light it, but you actually would have to have made that candle as well.
And that was your only source of light. So if you didn't make your candles for the week or the month, you were going dark for a few days.
Yeah. And Mark, just behind you, a huge spinning wheel. I don't know if that would be typical for a kitchen or not, but
it could be sometimes. When a woman would not be cooking, she would spin, and vice versa. So if there was a stew over the fire, or if she had put bread in her 17-hand oven while she was waiting and she had some downtime, she could keep spinning. Now, as you alluded to, this is a very large wheel. This is not your typical small spinning wheel that you see in books and things. This is what they called a walking wheel, in that you would actually have to physically walk behind it in order to make it operate. But you could oftentimes multitask when you were in the kitchen. Not every house did it, but it wasn't uncommon.
Right. Let's have a look at the next room, if we may.
Certainly. We'll go into the office.
Oh, Mark, this is a spacious room. What are we seeing here?
This is Colonel Denison's office, and so now we can talk a little bit about the man behind the house. Nathan Denison was probably most famous for being the second in command at the Battle of Wyoming, which was a major Revolutionary War battle. Took place just a few miles down the road in what's now Exeter, on the Schooley Farm, where Schooley Avenue is now. That's, of course, where the namesake comes from. And Colonel Denison was actually the commander of the 24th Connecticut Militia Regiment, because this area was all Connecticut at the time due to dueling land claims. Still technically should be Connecticut, but we won't get into that. And so the 24th Connecticut was our local militia regiment. It still exists today. It's the 109th Field Artillery. Interestingly enough, if you ever see the 109th, they're honor guard. They carry both the Connecticut and Pennsylvania flags with them. And so he was second in command at the battle because Colonel Zebulon Butler had come down. Now, Colonel Butler was actually a Continental regular, but he was from this area. He was from Wilkes-Barre. So Washington freed him and some men from the 3rd Independent Unit, and they came down to assist with the battle. After the battle was over, it was a terrible defeat for the Americans, one of the worst defeats of the American Revolution on our side. There was a terrible massacre. Denison is holed up in the Fort of the 40, what's now 40 Fort, and with just a handful of men left, and he's stalling, and he doesn't want to surrender to the British because he's trying to let Colonel Butler and some of the other Continental regulars flee. And the reason for that is if you were fighting the British during the Revolution, but you were a militiaman, you weren't considered a real soldier. So they would take your weapons and they would basically give you a stern talking to, and they would make you swear an oath that you wouldn't take up arms against the king again. However, if you were Continental Army, you were a regular soldier and you became a POW. So Denison is stalling and stalling and stalling until he finally gets word that the Continentals are safely gone, and then finally goes, okay, I guess I'll surrender. And this table here is actually where the entire Wyoming Valley was surrendered to the English. At least the tabletop. The legs have been replaced, I believe, but the tabletop is correct. And so we have a reproduction of the treaty here, but basically he had to surrender all of the fortifications in the entire Wyoming Valley over to the English. So Fort Wilkes-Barre, the Fort of the 40, Fort Pittston, Fort Shawnee down in Plymouth. All of these had to turn over their arms and turn this area over to the British, who then left it to the Iroquois. This was all Iroquois territory at the time. So it's a very important piece of history. However, after the war, the colonel became a judge. He presided over weddings in what is now the new Luzerne County, which was carved out of Northumberland County as part of the settlement of what we call the Yankee-Pennamite dispute over whether this was Pennsylvania or Connecticut.
In that capacity, would this have been his office?
This would have been his office, yes. Now, this house was built a little bit later. This was 1790, but by this point, he did need an office. So you have his desk over behind you with some of his paperwork. He would look at some court writs and things. We have some of his seals over on the table. We have a reproduction of one of his signatures. Now, this is from later on, the latter part of the 1780s, where he actually signed his name, Nathan Denison, Judge. It wasn't his last name, that was just his title.
They also use these wax seals on documents. How were they used?
Well, you have your wax here, and you would heat it up until it would melt on the paper, and you would get a little dot. And then you have your seal. Now, this one isn't the same as that one. This one's just a little eagle, but it could be whatever you want. And while the wax was still hot, you would stamp the paper, and you would get a very nice imprint. Not everyone used a stamp. Most people did, but some people actually had the imprint on a ring, and you could stick the ring into the paper as well. And that gave you the same idea. And you get these nice little seals.
And it's they each have their own identifying image on them as well. So a desk like this would be a piece of furniture like this with all of the areas for paperwork and such and storage. This would be something he would use all the time. I notice also behind you a huge grandfather clock. I don't know, would that have been something that would have been here pretty much early on?
This would have been here when this house was finished and when this house was commissioned, because of course a judge would be a little bit more well off than everyone else in this area. This was mostly a farming community, and a grandfather clock even back then was a very expensive piece of equipment, piece of furniture. So this would have been something he would have saved up for a little bit later on, just to show his prominence in his office. But it also fits in with the more New England style theme, because of course this is a New England house. They're New England settlers, they're from Connecticut, and this is more in that theme as opposed to the rest of the house.
And of course a fireplace in this room as well. I gather primarily for heating purposes?
Yes. This is the second of the 5 in the house, and as you say, Dave, this is for heat. as well as for light. Now you can see it's a little bit bigger in here than some of the ones we're going to see as we go through the rest of the house, because you'd be doing a little bit more work in here. If Colonel Denison would have individuals over for business, you might have a crowd in here, you might have company. You want it to be a little bit more warm than you might keep it if it was just the family, say.
I notice a table in the corner with some fancy glassware there. So you might well entertain in here then.
Yes,
someday.
you might well entertain. You know, you have your glassware over there on that table. You have playing cards. So you may have company over to entertain. Mostly men would be the ones in here. Also in the far corner, you have the family Bible. And it's very interesting because it's open to the family record. This was one of the earliest ways to record genealogy, was you would write down your family tree, your family history in the pages and the margins of your family Bible.
So again, this is an actual Bible.
Yes.
But in these particular pages, you've got dates of births and weddings, things like this.
And this would be passed on from generation to generation until, you know, finally within the last 125 years, people actually started keeping better genealogical records, and this tradition sort of went by the wayside. But this was a big thing in the Wyoming Valley. The Denisons did it, the Swetlands did it. A lot of families in this area had a Bible with all their important dates in it.
So a lot of history in there. Mm-hmm. And you had also mentioned the playing cards, which are kind of interesting. So I guess that even then, a game of cards was the way to pass some time during the day or during the evening.
It was a great way to entertain yourself. It was a great way, not necessarily the colonel, but a lot of other people would gamble. And it's interesting because you notice no numbers on the cards.
Yeah, it's just the symbol.
You have to think on your feet pretty quickly. And it makes it interesting with the king and the jack, because the only real difference is the king looks one way and the jack looks the other. And for the life of me, you know, if you get somebody shady, you can argue, oh no, this is the king and this is the jack.
But this was standard.
But this was standard
at the time. That's very impressive.
So you had to be a little bit quicker on your feet than you do with a game of poker today.
And let's go and take a look at the next room, if we may.
All right, we'll cut through into the family room then.
Well, Mark, what do you call this room?
Now, we refer to this as the family room. And this is really probably the most multi-purpose out of all the rooms here. And that's saying something, because all the rooms have quite a few uses. But the first thing you probably notice is it's pretty empty. Everything's against the walls. Now, this would be the way it would be when it wasn't in use. You may have noticed in the colonel's office, all the way along the wall, this little ledge. Well, this is the chair rail. And so you put all the furniture right up against the wall, all the chairs, all the tables, you put it right up against there to protect the walls, but to give you more space. Now, we call this the family room because the family would be in here quite a bit. You would pull your table out, you would play checkers, you might play a musical instrument of some variety, you might read the newspaper, and then when you were done, you'd put everything back. We also have the dining room table over there, which one is up against the wall to save space, but two, it actually has the eaves on the end, which you can open up to extend the table. So when it was time to eat, you'd pull the table out, you would extend it to its full length, set your chairs up around the center of it, and then you would eat there, because as we mentioned, you don't eat in the kitchen, you would eat in here. Right. And then when you were done, you would put everything against the wall again.
And then a built-in cabinet.
Once again, you need a lot more space. Here you see the china we mentioned earlier for only the most special of occasions. You would have that in there. On top, you could see more pewterware, which would be what you would use on a daily basis, your normal diningware for if you weren't entertaining. And so, you know, you have a little cabinetry here, you have a little bit more space just to keep this open between meals. You have another fireplace along the wall, again for heating, for light. If you're going to be reading here or if you're going to be playing a game, at night candles don't always cut it, so you want to have a little fire going into place, and of course during the winter you want to have one as well. But really this would be your everything room, almost what we would call a TV room today, where you would gather, you know, in between meals and before you would go to bed and before you would sleep.
Pass the time as a family.
Yes.
I notice a photograph on top of the small mantle there, and that appears to be this house, but there's something different on it. What is?
Well, there's quite a few things different. This This house was owned by the Denison family well into the 20th century, and then it was sold a few times and became a private residence. And it changed hands a number of times before the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania took it over, and then they, of course, gifted it to the Historical Society. But for each private owner that owned it, they added a little bit more to it. So you see in the back, there's a back wing. There's a whole nother story. The roof is different. It's much more pleated. There's a giant wraparound porch. It doesn't look at all like the New England, Connecticut house that we have today. What you also can't see in that photograph, because it's black and white, is the house at the time was actually fire engine red.
Oh my goodness.
You couldn't miss it. So oftentimes people will talk about the big red house on the corner of Denison Street and 44. That actually was this house, believe it or not.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. And most of what we see here is exactly the way we would have seen it, including all of the furniture moved against the wall.
Yes, in 1976 for the bicentennial, when the Commonwealth took away all of the additions that we talked about and brought it back to its more 1790 building, this is the way period correct it would be. Not all of the items are original to the house, but they are original to the time period. So this is the way that you would see it.
Now, we've looked at the downstairs, and very, very functional, obviously, for each particular purpose, but you have an upper floor.
We do.
So,
we have a second floor.
I wonder if we can go and take a look at that and see what's upstairs.
We can.
All right.
We'll go up, just watch your step on the stairs here. They're a little snug.
Mark, the downstairs is very impressive, but this is the first time I've seen the upstairs. Now, the first room we come into is this, and I mean, it's obviously a bedroom, but what can you tell us about it?
Well, this would have been Colonel Denison's bedroom. And so, of course, the first thing you notice is that it's a pretty good size, but only going two ways. You know, the ceiling is still pretty low.
Yeah.
And that's only partly because they like to say, you know, oh, people were shorter back then. Yes and no. So that's part of it, but the other reason is heating. Of course, we know heat rises, and so if you have very high ceilings, it becomes very difficult to heat. So unless you were very, very wealthy, you would try to keep your ceilings lower. That goes along with the fireplace that's just behind you there. Of course, as we talked about, almost every room in the house has its own fireplace for heating purposes. So with the low ceiling and the small fireplace right there, you could get the room fairly warm.
Well, you've also got what we know is a canopy bed.
Yes.
Does that have to do with the heating as well, or just the comfort?
Comfort, heating, some privacy. Now, you don't have it as much in this room because obviously the Colonel and his wife didn't share a bedroom with anyone else. But in other times, when there were multiple beds in a room, you'd be able to close the canopy and you'd have a little bit of privacy for yourself. The interesting thing about the canopy bed, or the four-poster bed, as you also see it listed as, is this would have been something that families, upper middle class, you know, slightly better off, this would be something that you would want to buy. This would be a presentation piece. So once you had a little bit of money, these were expensive. You know, they were custom made. As you can see, there's no king, queen, twin. It's not like we have today. So these were all custom made. They were not cheap pieces to buy compared to, say, a trundle bed or something else. So once you had a little bit of money, you would go out and you would purchase this. And interestingly enough, Dave, you're familiar with the saying, sleep tight?
Yes.
Well, of course, the beds back then were rope, as you could see here.
So there isn't a mattress per se?
No, there's not a mattress. You have this little undergarment here, which is straw and sometimes feathers, and it's, even if you run your hands over it, it's kind of picky. And so that's why you wouldn't want the bed bugs to bite, because they would often sleep in the hay. But every night as you would use this, the ropes would start to sag, and you would have to make adjustments going down the line to tighten them up. So if you slept tight, it would give you a good, firm rope mattress underneath.
In one sense, though, it's ultra modern because you can adjust it to your own needs.
Yes.
Really every evening.
It's the sleep number bed of its day.
Now, additionally, and you say this was his bedroom, but here we see a cradle. obviously a vintage type cradle. So I gather in the beginning, the youngster, the babe, would sleep right in the room with the parents.
Correct. When parents were nursing, of course, the Denisons were a bit better off, but they weren't rich enough to have a live-in midwife. They wouldn't have a nurse or anything. So the children would sleep right here until they became old enough to have their own room. Well, they would share a room. The boys would have one room, the girls would have another. And later on, once the birthing was done, the cradle would either be passed down, because families were large enough that usually by the time the last child was born, the oldest child might be getting ready to have one of their own. You don't know. Especially with the Denisons, they had a very long, there was a big gap between children. But if not, it would often be used for a doll, like what we have today. You know, the children could inherit it and take it over. You see that down the road at the Swetland House at our other properties. Once they get done with having kids, they would take the cradles for their own use.
And I think of the old rhyme, "Rock-a-bye baby," and indeed this is not only a cradle, but it does rock. It's on rockers.
Yes, it's on rockers, and oftentimes we don't have one in here, but you would see what they would call a nursing rocker, which would be a very low rocking chair. The idea being that you could sit next to the cradle and nurse one baby, and then just put your foot on the end of it and rock the other one. So you could actually cradle two babies at one time.
Very sparse with regard to furniture. Chest of drawers here, and a candle, of course, on top. And I gather the lighting would all be by candlelight?
Candlelight and the fire in the fireplace. And if you notice the chest of drawers, it's a little bit rougher around the edges, a little bit more beat up than the furniture we saw downstairs. And there was a reason for that. You didn't entertain upstairs.
Yes.
Me bringing you up here would be a major faux pas in the 1700s. So as you use your furniture downstairs and as you put some mileage on it, once it got, you know, maybe not the best looking, but still functional, you would move it upstairs to get a few more years out of it. You could also see the Colonel's shaving kit and a little wash basin on top with a little mirror. Of course, there are no bathrooms in the house, no plumbing, so you had to do all your daily toiletries just over your dresser and sort of multi-purpose. So it was a little bit rougher, especially on a colder day. You know, the daylight is getting shorter and shorter. You know, it's dark anymore when we wake up. So to wake up in the morning in the dark by candlelight and sit there with a straight razor, it wouldn't be the most fun thing.
A very interesting room. With regard to the fireplace, because you said that this obviously provided the heat for this room, but whenever you've got a fireplace, you always have the danger of fire.
Yes.
Was there anything that they would keep here just in case there were a problem?
A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times there were water buckets around. The problem with that is as the nights get colder, if you don't keep the room a certain temperature, water does tend to freeze. And if you're in a wooden bucket, water expands and contracts as it freezes and thaws out. But you would often see water buckets. Sometimes you would see early blankets try to, if it was a smaller fire, try to beat the fire out. But that really became more of a Victorian thing. The Victorians were much more terrified of fire. So much so that because they like to put candles on their Christmas trees, which would inevitably catch fire, they would actually have these big decorative Christmas water buckets and just hose the tree down. So there were precautions, but they weren't as out in the open about it as they were maybe 50 years down the road.
Well, let's take a look at the next room and see what we have there.
Sounds good.
Okay. Now, Mark, before you tell me anything else about this room, I notice immediately there's no fireplace.
Indeed,
So
very
what about
keen
heat
eye.
for here?
Well, this is the boys' room, the son's room, and as you correctly point out, Dave, this is the only room in the house without a fireplace. Now, as we talked about downstairs, the house is sort of, you know, a U shape, a horseshoe shape. Mm-hmm. We are above the kitchen. So that nice fire we have going downstairs is right below us. So the thought process is two. Number one, the boys being the boys are going to have to get a little tougher. They're going to have to get an edge so they can handle it being a little colder. But number two, as we talked about with the ceilings, heat rises. So we have the fire going below us. We have the chimney running right behind that wall in the center of the house. And they will get some residual heat. And you'll also have your blankets. Now notice too, with this bed, it's a little bit easier to see the rope work and the adjustments. It's the same concept, it's just a different design. Because of course, no two beds really were alike, unless you went to the exact same craftsman. So it's very similar. You have a small child's bed warmer here, which is another way they would get heat. They would go into the colonel's bedroom because there's no fireplace in here. You'd get some of the coals, you'd get some of the ash, and you could use it, basically like an iron. You would heat your blankets up. You could briefly keep it under the blanket as long as you were keeping an eye on it, because of course it's a fire hazard. And you could also keep it under the bed, and that would give you some more heat and warm the bed up before you climbed into it.
And the garments that we see displayed here, typical of the wear of what era?
These would be around the end of the 18th century, turn of the 19th century, so 1785, 1790, 1800, somewhere in that range. You have basically a shirt, not too similar. Men's fashion hasn't really changed all that much. This would be your everyday. You could feel it. It's rough. It's durable. You can wear it every day. You can get it dirty. You can get it ripped. Now, if you want to get a little bit more dressed up, of course, we have a few mannequins subbing in for the children today. Again, you can almost see the muslin. This would be your normal, breeches, a shirt. But if you wanted to get fancier, you could have a frock coat with many, many, many buttons. Men's fashion was all about buttons. That was how you decorated. Many buttons. The vest has many buttons. And then, of course, you'd have a little lace cravat, which evolved into our ties, of course. Very high collars, which at the time were detachable. They were a separate piece. And then you would wear lace sleeves under your jacket cuffs. You would have socks, and then your shoes would have breeches on them as well. So you could sort of see it's not too dissimilar from a double-breasted suit today. You still have a vest, you still have pants. We don't have nearly as long of a coat and nearly as many buttons, but you can basically see the roots of our fashion in it today. And hats. Men were very big into hats back then.
I was going to ask, because there was a hat on the bed as well, so that was standard wear when they were outside.
Yes, you'll notice the wide brims. It's designed to keep the sun out of your eyes, keep it out of your face. If it's raining outside, let the water roll off, because of course this area is farming communities. You're going to be outside working pretty much every day regardless of the weather if you want to survive. So your fashion had to be functional.
Now these that you've got on display, I haven't the faintest idea what we're talking about here.
Well, this is... These are fishing poles, versions of fishing poles that we use to demonstrate to children. Basically, you didn't have a rod and reel the way we do today. You couldn't go fly fishing. So you would get a stick, and you would get your weights and make a bobber, and then hopefully you'd catch some not cardboard fish. But we demonstrate to the children that you can pretty much make anything into a fishing rod. And you had to back then, because especially here in the 1790s, the Susquehanna River was still very much a source of food. So you had your nets, you had your traps, but a good old fishing pole and some bait in a couple of hours, you could do pretty well for yourself.
What about toys? You're talking about boys being in this room. I see no toys.
No, there would have been. Marbles was a big toy of the area. Spinning tops was another toy. A Jacob's ladder, which was an interesting little wooden piece which sort of falls. It's almost, goes back and forth almost like a slinky, but it's not a spring. It's a wooden, and it has pivots and it hangs. You can only describe it by itself. A Jacob's ladder is a Jacob's ladder. That was another big toy. The fishing poles, they would play with them because they're just sticks. They would play with those when they're not using them. So those were the main toys, but really, but you only played with toys for a few years, and then they were putting you to work. There were plenty of chores to do. You had to chop wood. You had to help out in the garden. You had to, keep everything clean. So it wasn't the easiest existence. It wasn't like today.
And this room, this size room, would have to accommodate virtually all of the children.
All of the male children, yes.
Yes.
You certainly would share. Nobody, aside from the colonel and his wife, nobody got their own separate rooms. So there would be multiple children here. I believe, I know that the Denisons had 4 boys. I believe they were all here at the same time. So you would be a little bit snug.
Sure, sure. I've just been enjoying the fire here, and I've certainly enjoyed being here, but I'm kind of wondering, like, can anybody just come here? How does that set up?
The house is open seasonally. We're usually open from May till about September, October on Sundays, and it's open to the public. All you have to do is contact us at the Historical Society. We can give you what Sundays it's open, and then you come on down and you get the full tour.
Well, it certainly has been an enjoyment for me. I hope that some of you will take advantage of this. It is a local great treasure, and you don't want to miss it. I'm Dave Decosmo on behalf of Mark Riccetti and the Luzerne County Historical Society. Thank you for joining us, and we hope we'll see you here